So your expectations for the GDP number?
We think it has been quite a resilient quarter for growth, looking at around 6.5% to 7% kind of a GDP print, which should mean that for the full year fiscal 24, we should be somewhere around 7.6 to 7.8 on the overall GDP. Yes, we have a little bit of divergence in the drivers of GDP, where it's driven more by the investment side of the economy rather than the consumption side of the economy. But the key question would also be the divergence between the GDP numbers and the GVA numbers, which has been a bit of a concern for investors. But we think that in this quarter, the divergence should narrow down to some extent, with only a 50 basis point divergence versus a 180 basis point divergence, which was seen in the last quarter.
So what's the longer-term outlook for India, given what you have just said? It is investment-led and consumption has been pretty lackluster.
I think the government is focusing a lot of supply-side measures, trying to create more infrastructure capacity, more manufacturing capacity. And the optimism is that with these supply-side measures, we will see more employment growth, more income growth, and that will finally make the demand side also recover. At this moment, like in a lot of other places in the world, we are also seeing some sort of a divergence between the higher end spending and the lower end of the spending. We think that this will narrow down as we progress, because India has a huge demographic dividend to work with. So we think that around 7 to 7.5% GDP growth over the next few years is quite doable. And if we do the right kind of reforms, then possibly we can push it up to even 9 to 10% as well. And given India's demographics, that's something which we need to aspire for.
This is a government that's looking at fiscal consolidation. Might that impact its investment plans, you think? Might that slow down, for instance, spending on infrastructure?
So at least for this year, the government has got a surprise bonanza from the RBI in the form of a larger than expected dividend of almost 0.4% of GDP extra. So when the new government presents the budget sometime in July, they will have the choice of using this 0.54% of GDP either for deficit reduction or expenditure increase. So even if they use up part of this for higher capex, then at least for the next year, the capex growth should be maintained. The bigger problem is not the money. The bigger problem is that we have to create the institutional capacity to spend this money in a more productive way for infrastructure development, not just in roads and railways, but in a wider variety of public capex, including places like urban infrastructure, water, power, etc. So it's a long process, and I think the government is quite committed to it, because that's how we will reduce our cost difference between India and rest of the world on manufacturing side, and that could make India the manufacturing powerhouse which it wants to become.
One of the big questions in the market is when the RBI will start cutting rates. When do you see a pivot from the RBI? Do you expect it to be able to be independent of the Fed, or will it be waiting on the Fed?
Our sense is that RBI is very committed to seeing the 4% inflation target to be met, not just comfortable with any number between the 4 to 6 range that it is there right now. So from that perspective, RBI will probably wait for a few more months. Maybe around October is when we start seeing the first rate cut. That's because by then they will have visibility that in 2025, inflation is aligning towards the 4% mark. They will also have clarity on how the monsoon has progressed, and will have better clarity on how the global rate cycle is evolving, including in Fed. So that kind of gives them the right backdrop to start the easing cycle. So October is our call for the first rate cut, but it will be a very shallow rate cut cycle, not expecting more than 50 basis point of rate cut this year.
Samiran, Sajing, temperatures in India, 52 degrees right now. How might that impact the economy?
So this is quite unprecedented, and obviously there is some fear that this can feed into inflation. Our sense is that this is not an immediate thing because we just had the winter crop harvest, which was quite good. So how this filters into the summer harvest is what we need to see. As of now, the prediction is that this is going to be a good year for monsoon. All the forecasts are talking about a normal monsoon, no El Nino effect this year. So that could potentially mean that you somehow able to scrape through this period without much inflation effect. My only worry is that if this heat wave has affected the quality of the winter crop, then maybe it filters into inflation with a 3 to 6 month lag.